and welcome to Vista Talks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I'm your host for today, Simon Hodgkins, and I'm delighted to be joined by John Walsh. John is the co-founder of LocStep, Vendor Management Solutions, together with Barbara Castley, a localization outsourcing company that assists client-side localization teams to manage their vendor relationships more effectively. John is a localization expert. I know he specializes in enabling in-house teams to operate in a lean environment. John offers fractional localization team support, which means he augments in-house teams with localization professionals to set up and manage all their delivery operations. His goal is to allow in-house teams to focus on what matters most, such as market performance and customer experience interests of the industry. And he's also advocating for favorable regulatory frameworks. John, you're very welcome to the show. Let's move on, as I've got a number of questions I want to put to you today. Maybe could you start off with talking a little bit about fractional localization team support that I mentioned there? How does this work? How can it really help these in-house teams? And also a bit about this lean environment.
Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks for having me, Simon. Pleasure to be here. So I suppose this is kind of core to why LocStep was set up. So we founded LocStep in June, July this year. So we're only a couple of months into it. Looking at what's happened in the past couple of months within the tech industry, you've got massive redundancies, you've got the introduction of AI, you've got reorgs, everything. Localization teams are just being forced basically to operate in a much more lean environment when it comes to internal headcounts. So we came across this concept of the fractional team, which is growing in popularity, which is basically allows organizations to pull in expertise, to augment, to infuse specialized talent without having to hire a team of 5 people or 6 people or whatever it might be. So that's why we wanted to set up LocStep, to really kind of help the localization teams bring in the talent they need without having a full-time dedicated headcount. Depending where you are in your company journey, if it's a startup environment, headcount is precious. You want to make sure that you're putting it into what really matters most. And likewise, if you're even in a more mature organization, you might just not have the headcount or just more strategic places to put it in there. So where we really want to kind of come in and add value is to augment these teams and be able to give the expertise on like how to run the operations, or like whether it's to provide the strategy and guidance or to actually do the day-to-day management of operations for the teams. So we really want to kind of build out a team that would be kind of more usually seen in an in-house buyer-side team as opposed to an LSP. So we're not trying to become the LSP. We're not a team of project managers to do the daily shifting of workload. We'd be setting up the processes, like whether it's finding a new TMS or finding running an RFP to find the vendors to actually do the work for you. Really the in-house kind of strategic initiatives that people have on their list, but they just don't have the bandwidth to get done. So that's really where we can kind of come in and add value and kind of help out the teams there. That could be anything. It could be 2 hours a week for a startup. It could be multiple headcounts for a larger organization. Really depends on the customer, on their needs, their requirements. We will be the ones that will flex for the customer needs. So, they're not stuck with an FTE where they're only busy for part of the time. So that's really where I think we're trying to come in and solve that problem for our customers.
And John, that's really interesting, because we've seen sort of fractional approaches to work in other, I hear of, fractional CEOs or fractional sales directors or fractional marketing people or whatever. And so to bring this fractional localization support in, as you say, depending on what your client requires, seems very helpful, particularly at this time. We're hearing terms like lean localization, and we're hearing terms, we do know at the time of recording, some companies have unfortunately had to, reduce their headcount somewhat. And we see that in the technology sector as well, even outside of the language industry. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's always hiring, there's always letting people go. We have this sort of AI thing in the corner as well, which is gathering steam. But I wanted to maybe talk a little bit, sort of adding on to what you're saying there about fractional localization support, is this sort of maturing of localization processes. Now, I'd be very interested to understand, and for our people watching and listening to this episode, how do you believe that your approach can help companies achieve this sort of localization maturity aspect?
Yeah, I mean, it's the maturity model. I think it's the CSA. I could be fact checked on this one, but I think it was the CSA that came up with the maturity model, from be a reactive team right through to, I think, transparency is the last one, where localization is ingrained within the organization. And where there's a lot of talk about what to do to move through the maturity model. Work with your stakeholders, report, like get involved and get upstream early, get involved in the design process, get localization like really embedded within the process. So everybody talks about what to do, but nobody talks about how to do it. And again, that's kind of where we feel we can come in. When you're talking about localization program, you have the day-to-day workload that needs to be done, and that takes up headcount and bandwidth. But then you've got this strategic initiatives, that you need to be running, as I said, whether it's running an RFP, you need to find new technology, or you need to figure out how AI can plug in. It just takes time, it takes bandwidth. It's very hard to hire somebody specifically to come in and just do that one project. And again, that's where the fractional kind of approach will come in. We can be that extra pair of hands for customers, help either run those strategic initiatives directly, or take some of the day-to-day operational overhead away from them to free up their own internal bandwidth. So
yeah, it makes sense, John. And I think that CSA research that you're referring to, that localization maturity model, we see various companies, don't we, of all shapes and sizes, that sort of start off at the bottom of that sort of pyramid and go, we have no idea what we're doing here, through to
absolutely. And
the
it's
most
not
advanced, right?
it's not even, there's companies that I've worked with and worked for in the past, you assume they're far along, they're not. You will always be surprised. Multiple times I've seen where somebody comes along and they say that they're building the foundations. They're at stage one. You want to build the foundations, and then they need to grow the scale, so they have to focus on scale. And then they've realized they've scaled too fast or too much, and now they need to fix the foundations. Next thing you know, you're 3 or 4 years into your localization program, and you're only starting to think about, how do I engage with senior leadership? How do I add the value? How do I really kind of come in? And again, that's kind of where I think that we can really bring the value of like coming in and helping. We will build your foundations. We will help on the operational side. We'll take the operational overhead off of you as a localization manager. You focus on how to get to steps 4 and 5 of that maturity model, how to engage with your leadership and your cross-functional teams and things like that. And then it frees them up as well. They can focus on the headcount, the skills gaps that they have in their team. Maybe they need a data analyst as opposed to another project manager, because they can focus on all of these things, knowing that we've got their best interests in mind, and we're looking after the day-to-day operations. They get a simple monthly MBR with us, and we're telling them how everything is going on, or a weekly update, whatever they prefer. And we're doing all of the legwork and managing their operations. So that's really kind of where we can see like the fractional coming in. It may not be a full-time dedicated role. They may not have headcount to provide to that role, and that's where we can kind of come in and do it.
Yeah, and I suppose through those monthly business reviews or weekly updates or whatever your client's requesting, there's an element of them also checking in, understanding how it's progressing,
Yeah.
and there's an element of learning in that. But something you said earlier that I just wanted to go back to, because I don't want to lose that thought, is the importance of the theory versus the practical. And you kind of touched on that when you were saying, well, you can have all the models and you can have the localization maturity index, and you can understand what you need to do, but actually doing it, the actual process of doing it, that seems to be where your sweet spot is. You're not sort of replacing the LSP, but you are helping people move from theory or aspirational goals in this area to, well, this is actually what you need to do on the ground. Am I right in saying that, John?
100%. And that's the thing. I mean, it's very hard to turn around and say you want to focus on the upstream, the performance of my content in market, when your day-to-day bread and butter is your delivery model. And you can't take your eyes off that until you're confident that it's running smoothly and that it's running well. And that's where we kind of come in and make sure that it is running smoothly. The LSP, our kind of mantra really is that we want to build win-win relationships with our vendor, with the clients and with the vendors. And for everything to work well, you want your vendors to be performing well. Your client's localization manager has the trust that everything is being looked after. They can focus upstream. And ultimately, like, there's multiple parts in play for localization team to be efficient and to work well and to be effective. So that's where we want to come in and kind of plug that gap, allow localization managers focus on the strategy, on the upstream, help your vendors to perform better, get more value out of them, build those real win-win relationships and long-term relationships and partnerships.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about that, because bridging the gap between the client, your client, the company, and the vendors in the process can be quite a challenge, can't it? Because you have the localization service provider. You also have a lot of tools providers out there. You have a lot of other sort of, we've seen a lot of technology companies getting involved in this sort of process as well. So is there anything that you do in particular to help people to bridge that gap between, say, the client and everybody else? Because there's a lot of people in the mix now, or can be.
Yeah, there is. So I suppose I've been fortunate enough that like I've worked on both sides of the industry. I've, worked as an account manager on the vendor side, as project manager on the vendor side. I've worked as a program and project manager on the client side, as a vendor manager on the client side. So I've got empathy for both sides. I've got all due respect for both sides. They're completely different worlds and completely different, needs and requirements and pressures and everything like that. We're kind of where we want LocStep to come in and build those relationships is to kind of keep the focus on the vendors, and keep the focus on the clients at the same time. So telling the clients what the vendor is seeing. So they're the ones that are closest to your content, they're closest to your product. Making sure that that's been passed along, that the feedback is coming in, that, if the content creation isn't great, making sure that that's getting there and feeling strong enough in ourselves to actually represent that view as well and push back, as opposed to just being an LSP who may feel like, just deal with it. That's your job, just deal with it. And I've seen that multiple times. It doesn't do anybody any favors. And then likewise, flipping that across, of a client may articulate their needs and requirements, actually translating that into a deliverable from a vendor side can be quite hard. I speak a lot about, localization managers need to learn the language of their stakeholders and their senior leadership. I also think the vendors need to learn the language of the localization manager and, bridging that gap. And that's where we can come in. We have straddled both sides of that industry. We sit in the middle. We will help, articulate the needs and requirements, put them into plans and actions, and really just make sure that that both sides are operating well. That is the best case scenario for everybody, is when everybody is operating efficiently and effectively. That's where the most value is coming out of your program.
No, I get that. That makes a lot of sense, John. And I suppose I don't want us to be accused of talking theory here either. So I'm going to ask you, put you on the spot a little bit. I'm going to ask you for maybe an example about this sort of win-win approach, because you're seeing it from both sides, right? You've got expertise in both sides. But has there been sort of partnerships that maybe you've built in the past, and how you saw it adding that value to both parties?
So the one that jumps to mind, and I won't name names for confidentiality, obviously. So previous experience. So when I got involved, we had a vendor that was underperforming. The sentiment from the in-house team was, they're terrible, let's offboard them. Kick off an RFP, you start to change. An RFP takes 6 months minimum, by the time you get through the process and everything like that. So in the meantime, we started looking at the vendor. We started looking and seeing, well, what is going on? Why is it broken? We obviously don't want to replicate a broken process with a new vendor, whatever. So, really stripped it apart and took the objective view on what was going on and mapped everything out in a visual format. And really, when you start to see it in a visual, it's like, well, that is chaos. That's carnage. Why is that happening? And it turned out to be more of a case of a death by 1,000 razors, as opposed to one huge issue that was happening. When I say like that, basically stemmed from the client side was asking the vendor to add this extra check. There was a quality issue, so add an extra check. There's another issue, add that. There's another issue, add that. And the vendor just accepted it and received it and onboarded it. So all of a sudden, you've got this really convoluted process. You've got a vendor that's doing checks that's eating into their margins, so they're not making the money. They have to cut corners somewhere else. They have to do, all of these other things that are going on in the back end. And really kind of went in, stripped it back, had a look, really like the 5 whys is something that I always jump to. It's from the lean methodology, something a 5-year-old would do. It's just keep asking why. Why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? And to really get down to the core of it. And when we changed a lot on what was happening on the client side before the vendor even got the work, and really kind of changed the whole operations of what was going on. in doing so, we actually gave more responsibility, more ownership to the vendor to actually own the language, to actually own the process more. And that, like, the biggest outcome of all of that is, like, within 6 months, we start to see the turnaround with that vendor. Within 9 months and 12 months, it was a complete 180. They were the strongest performing vendor. They were doing, like, the meeting all expectations. You know, it really was a success story. But it just built the trust, and it really changed the sentiment within the team internally as well. That's the hardest thing to change as well, right? Is that trust. It takes a long time to build that trust. But, you know, you could see that they were investing in it. You could see that they cared about the work, they cared about the project, about the client relationship, and it really turned it around. So, you know, that it's uncomfortable. You have to have a lot of frank discussions with your client team, have a lot of frank discussions with your vendor team, like what's gone wrong. It's your fault, it's their fault. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. You just need it to be working smoothly. And that's something, again, where LocStep can come in. We're vendor agnostic. We kind of don't have skin in the game, so to speak, in terms of change of process. It's not going to impact us. It's more client, our vendor. So we're not covering our ass when we recommend something. We're doing it for the greater good of the overall program and the process. You know, and that's kind of, we've taken those experiences, those types of experiences, and we're bringing them into LocStep, and we want to give them to our customers then. So, you know, rather than the customer going through and falling into the same pitfalls, we can help them remove those, avoid them, you know, and kind of get the best value out of their relationships with their vendors.
That's a great example, and also I'll come back to value as well, because I wanted to ask you about adding value to your customers, to your clients, and the value that you can provide to prospective clients as well. So, you know, whether that's getting more value from vendors, like you were just maybe talking about, or maybe even streamlining some of those internal processes that you were touching on. I mean, have you got any examples, you know, maybe it's projects or things you've done in the past or things that you're working on at the moment? Again, you don't have to go into who the clients are or anything like that. But just ways that you can help, you know, LocStep can help people find these continuous improvements, because it is a continuous improvement process, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. Like, localization as a rule just does not stand still. It's constantly moving, constantly evolving. You know, you've got marketing teams that will work on the newest and latest, you know, platform to create their content, and you need to adapt to make that. Everything is always changing. AI is coming on. That's changing everything. So I suppose where we add value, like, first and foremost, like, our role is here to make the localization managers' lives easier, to help them to be the extra pair of hands, you know, help them get projects off the ground. We take the operational overhead. They can focus on the strategy, on the in-house upstream. You know, as I said a while ago, they can hire the data analyst instead of another project manager. They can focus on performance. You know, when you look at metrics, you've got operational metrics, which is how is your program performing. Like, your vendors, are they on time? You know, time, cost, quality. But then you have your performance metrics. How's your content and your products performing in country? Is the user numbers? Is customer satisfaction improving? And focus on that. So we can look after the operational. The localization managers can look after the performance in parallel, as opposed to getting all of this fixed first and then moving on to the second one. So that's kind of, you know, where, first and foremost, I suppose, where we want to add the value. And then more from a tactical point of view, like, as I mentioned, we don't have skin in the game. If we want to, you know, we're not a tools provider, we're not an LSP. So if something needs to change, it's objective. It's for the better, greater good. You know, where our longevity as a company will come from being seen as adding value to our customers, and that's what we want to keep doing. You know, so if somebody sees value in us, they will keep us there, and that's the way we want to run our business. It's funny enough, actually, for a new company, we've actually said no to customers twice already, which, when I was setting out to do this, I probably didn't think I was going to do, but there was no value in us getting involved. There was no value in the customer going down that road. So actually, I feel, as somebody who used to buy these services, being told no is actually refreshing at times. You know, it's just not this yes, and all of a sudden in 6 months you're trying to unpack it all because it's completely wrong direction. So we've already said no to 2 customers. So I hope they don't hold it against me, that it is for their good that we've said no as well. You know, and that's, like, ultimately, like, that continuous improvement. Like, when we do get involved, we're looking at the day-to-day now, but we're also, like, the no's that we said no to was because we know from what our experience, then in 6 to 12 months, it's going to bite them in the ass. It's going to come back and it's going to reflect badly on us because we left it happen. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking at the day-to-day now, but also what's likely to happen in 6 or 12 months, and make sure that we're trying to get out ahead of that, and that the vendors are getting out ahead of that as well, so that, you know, when you scale and you take on new content types, or you take on new languages, all of a sudden your process that worked well for 4 languages doesn't completely overrun you now that you've got 12. So, you know, that's really where we look for the continuous improvements and the kind of long-term efficiency of a program.
So I just want to squeeze in 2 quick questions if I can, John. I'm going to ask you in a moment if there's any sort of last thoughts you want to share with our audience. But before I get to that, I'm going to ask you to go back to you about stakeholders and stakeholder engagement, if I can. Because obviously with LocStep, you're sort of empowering these localization managers or the people that are involved in various client companies to, you know, get the localization program effective and improving, but also to manage, could be managing the C-suite, or explaining to other people throughout their company why things need to be done a certain way. And some people may struggle with managing stakeholders internally and externally. And I'm just wondering if you've got any initial thoughts on that, particularly at a time where you may have lost people in your language localization team at your company. Maybe a couple of senior people are no longer there and you're left sort of struggling with this stakeholder engagement. Or maybe just in general, you know, maybe you're low down on that localization maturity index and you're trying to help people understand where you're trying to get to. Have you any sort of thoughts on stakeholder engagement that you could share with us here today?
Yeah, I think it does come back to that maturity model that I mentioned earlier of, you know, you need to learn the language of your stakeholders, learn the language of your C-suite. Like, what are they? One of the things that I heard recently in another podcast or talk, and it really kind of summarizes it, is like, in localization teams, we talk about how we're doing in German, but C-suite are asking how are we doing in Germany, like how are we doing in the country? And that's really where you need to pivot your conversation of like, how's your product performing? Are you growing at the same rate as your other the other markets? Are you growing at the same rate as English? What's your user experience like, or your lead generation, or whatever is most important for your company? You really need to understand your market fit and like for that language and for that market. And that's where localization teams need to pivot and think more about international performance and growth as opposed to language performance. You know, obviously language performance is important, but that's your bread and butter. That's expected. That's nobody would commend you for getting your language right. That's baseline expectations. You know, that's where you really need to grow your kind of the language that you're speaking to your stakeholders and to your leadership, and start to learn what's important to them and translate your efforts into that language.
Thanks for sharing that, John, because I know that's a hot topic at the moment for quite a few clients in terms of that stakeholder engagement. It's really an important element. So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. So look, I'm going to wrap up by asking you if there's any sort of last thoughts or anything else you'd like to share with our audience today. And of course, where's the best place for people to connect with yourself, John, or Barbara and the LocStep team if they're interested in finding out more?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of last thoughts, I've probably done more research or an outreach within the localization industry in the past 2-3 months than I have in the past decade. So obviously founding this company, there's a lot I needed to figure out. Is this just in my head, or is there actually a viable business model here, right? So spoke to a lot of people, listened to a lot of podcasts and talks, read a lot of articles. And the one thing that's common across the conversations, across all of the research, is that the role of the localization manager, the role of the localization team is changing. And whether that's being forced upon you by reorgs or downsizing within companies, or it's the introduction of AI, people need to be more efficient. They need to be, you know, more like leaner, everything like that we've spoken about already. But it is changing. So basically, like my kind of thinking on the industry right now is that what worked last year, what worked 2 or 3 years ago, is not going to work next year or 2 years' time. So I think the role, like if I was in the shoes of a localization manager right now, I'd be trying to identify what skills gaps are in my team. You know, what do I need to bring into the team to, you know, push us along that maturity model to get further buy-in upstream, or, you know, get buy-in from executives, not be seen as a delivery center. adding that real value and be seen as like a real value add to the company as opposed to a cost center. How do you do that? Start to carve out that time, find that bandwidth, start to think through it, plan it out. What are the leadership looking for now? What are they likely to start changing the conversation to in 6 months' time if it's AI, or like, where is it going to implement? There's a huge challenge ahead of people right now. So it's kind of sink or swim. It's either embrace it and kind of move with it, or kind of be left and seen as the delivery center that, ultimately I don't think anybody really wants to be seen to. As for getting in touch with myself directly on LinkedIn, John Walsh on LinkedIn, or LocStepVMS.com. We've got a nice new website up there, kind of giving a bit more detail about what we offer and how, like, kind of our values and our mantra about how we engage with our customers and what we want to bring to them. But yeah, feel free to reach out, and we're obviously more than happy to help anybody regardless of where they're at in their journey. I think we can plug in and add value.
Well, thank you, John. That brings us nicely to the end of today's show with John Walsh. Please make sure to tune in again to see and/or listen to our next Vista Talk show, where once again we'll be discussing some interesting topics with interesting people, just like John from all around the world. And do make sure you go out and check out everything that John and Bob are doing over at LocStep. They really are making a difference to some of those leading clients around the world. So go and check out LocStep. Thank you, John. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Simon. It's been a pleasure.